Hello everybody and welcome to my video on this, you might be able to see it there, the Zeiss Ikon, what's that say? Goerz Frontar DRP, that's the lens. This is the Baby Box Tengor 5418. Oh, there it is, Box Tengor on the back. And we know it's the baby box because it's tiny and uses 127 film. This is a 127 format, 3 cm by 4 cm negative size, which makes it a half frame camera technically because the 127 format was originally 4 cm by 6.5. So this is a half frame box 127 camera. It has no light meter, a rotary shutter with 2 shutter speeds of bulb, which is where you push this down and the shutter stays open, not right now. And then we'll see how to use the shutter in a moment. And then a second shutter speed of instant, which is approximately 1/45th of a second. It apparently ranges anywhere from 1/30th to 1/60th based on age, use, things like that. That's likely to have a high level of variability in these cameras because they are now closing in on 100 years old, and metal kind of gets worn out, and these have metal springs. It has no flash sync, which means that you cannot trigger a flash from this camera, but yes, you can use a flash, and we'll talk about that later in the video. And this is, just as a note, one of the smallest cameras I've ever used. It's definitely the smallest 127 camera I've ever used. And it can still take some pretty decent photos, as you've seen throughout the intro here, with some sample photos that I took with this actual camera. Now, this target's market was the high-end entry user. What I mean by that is this is a Zeiss with a Goerz lens on it. That's, if you don't know who Goerz is, they made the best large format lenses, better than Zeiss. And I have a Zeiss and a Goerz from the same era that I use with my 8x10. And the Goerz is from 1923. It's a 12-inch f/5.5 Sealor. It is one of the sharpest lenses I own. It's a little 4-element lens. It's literally 100 years old as I make this video, and it is stunning. Goerz made amazing lenses. So this has a Goerz lens on it. It's made by Zeiss, high-end. We know it's entry because it is super basic, super simple. It's also a 127 camera, which was geared at the entry-level user because it was less expensive, but could still create negatives that would fit into a standard slide projector for 35mm slides. 3x4 on this is only slightly larger than the 2.4 by 3.6 you get with 35mm negatives. So 127 was generally geared towards learners and vacationers. This created those slightly larger than 35mm negatives, which gave you a resolution boost, and given that this has a 50mm lens on it, it becomes slightly wider than normal. I didn't do the math, but I'm going to guess this in full frame terms would create images around about a 45mm lens's angle of view. It includes a shutter lock. The later versions did. The earliest versions of this camera did not have a shutter lock, which would mean that if this wire was down, the shutter would trigger. But because mine is not triggering, we know that this is probably an older camera, but not from the first batch of them. There was also a higher spec version of this lens. This has a 5 cm or 50mm f11 Frontar. The higher spec version had a 50mm f6.3 Novar focusable lens, and that was called the 54/18E. It was made by Zeiss in Germany, starting in 1930, hitting the market in 1931, apparently. This design that you see here was made until 1934. The Frontar f11 that had a diamondish type shape on the front of it, or more like a rectangle with diamonds or triangles at the top and the bottom, that went into production in 1934 and lasted until 1938. That's the best information I could find. The sources I read on this conflicted across the board on that. So there was no agreement, but I think that is accurate. Largely because that information came from Pacific Rim, and they do their research when it comes to old camera info. This was preceded by nothing directly, as it was developed for an interest in the 127 format and all other smaller formats, as the 1930s brought on an economic depression worldwide, and so smaller, less expensive film became more in vogue. And it was followed by nothing directly because the 40s came around, and after the war, people had money again. So, as we do, we're going to go over everything that is on this camera, and we'll start here on the top. These are the Viewfinder framing parts here. So if you want to, you can pop up the frames. There we go. You can see here the one in the back and the one in the front. This is your shutter lock, so now the shutter will work. We'll see more of that in a minute. So to frame up your image, you just look through the back here and square up what you're looking at, and that gives you a rough estimation of what is going to be on your image. On the front, there's a lot to see. The lens. On the back, also a lot to see. The 2 frame count windows. And when we load film in just a moment or two, I'll show you how to use these. On the bottom, again, lots to see. Tripod socket. On this side, lots to see. Tripod socket. And on this side, we can just skip it. No, I'm just kidding. There's plenty to see over here. This down here is your cable release. So if you have a cable that can screw into that, you can use it. Shutter button. This is your film back release. I'll show you that in just a moment. This is your shutter mode switch. So if this is pushed in, you're in instant. If it's pulled out, you're in bulb. Okay. So that's what bulb looks like. That's what instant looks like. And this is your film advance. To get inside of the camera, you simply grab this little loop here and pull it outward until that lock is disengaged. And then the camera just slides apart. All right, so here's the back of the camera. And you can see this is kind of gunky looking. When I got this, somebody had taken black paper and glued it all over the entire back of this. I assume they had been using this for 35mm film, but that was awful to get off, let me tell you. So there's still a little bit of black paint on that bottom window that I just couldn't remove. So at any rate, here's the inside of the back of the housing. And you can see those red windows with the little triangles there that are designed to indicate where the numbers should be lined up as we advance the film. This is the shutter window here. This is the upper film roller and the bottom film roller. This is where we will load the film spool in just a moment. And this is the take-up spool, which is where we will connect the film to attach it to be advanced through the camera. While we've got this open, we might as well load film. So it takes 127 film. This is just paper, so it's going to be, so it's, as you can see, has been used many times in other cameras, maybe even actually in this one as well. But to take a 127 roll of film, all we're going to do is put it into the film holder like this, so that the spool, the ends of it go to these 2 holes. We're going to pull out a film leader, going to pull it outward, and we're going to feed the leader into the take-up spool. Just like that, okay? Once we've gotten it into the take-up spool, we're going to hold on to it just a little bit and advance the film. And this holding on to it allows us to try to get it lined up so that the paper is centered. You want to have the paper centered because if it's not, which this is not, there we go, that's better. If the paper is not centered, then what happens is that it gets torn up as it advances through the camera. This did not happen in this camera. This tear-up happened in a different camera, but the same thing can happen. So 127 you want to make sure is lined up well. Then we're going to just start advancing and taking it up on the spool until we get these arrows just somewhere out here. Once these are out here, then we're going to take the back of the camera and we're going to reassemble it. This cutout slides underneath this metal plate right here, okay? Now we've got it together. It clicks into place. Mine does anyway. Yours might not. These are 100 years old. Who knows? And then once this lock is down, we know that we're in good shape. We're going to look through these windows here. And this one with the black paint on it, very easy to see through there. We're going to advance until we see the number 1 in that window. Okay, I know you can't see it because of the black paint. I almost can't see it either, but the number 1 is there right now, okay? So when we have it loaded, we can now take photos, which would basically just be undoing a lock and activating a shutter, just like that, okay? So we're going to take our photo, and now we're going to advance the film, and we can see the name of the film coming up here, and then the number 1 appears in this window. Now we're going to take another shot, click, click, then we advance until we see 2 here, and basically what we're going to do is every time we see a number in here, we're going to take a photo when it's down here, and then we're going to advance it and take a photo when it's up here. And that way, we get double the number of frames that a normal full-frame 127 camera would have. That's why this is a half-frame camera. So 1, 1, advance, click, second frame, advance, number 2 here, click, and keep going. Okay, and that's how we load film and how film moves through the camera. I'm going to show you inside. Now, film is one and done. So if you were to do this with your camera for real, you would erase much of the film. But when you advance the film, what you're doing is pulling the film and the paper onto the upper take-up spool, and the numbers, which are what are right here that we read through the window, just advance as we move the film to the camera. So I'm going to advance the film all the way to the very end so that you can see how it works going through the camera. 8 will be the last number. So we have taken our 16th frame, and now we're going to start advancing. You should be able to hear that outside of the camera. And then when you finish advancing at that point, you can now take the back off of the camera, and we're going to take the spool out from up top here, and we're going to take this spool down here on the bottom, and we're going to move it into the top. Whoa. So we'll have our now empty spool, put it into the top up here, and into the top over here. And we'll advance this until it clicks into place. And once this is spinning, and we can see that notch, the take-up slit right there spinning as we advance the film knob, now we know it's loaded correctly, and we can put our next roll of film in. So we've seen how to load film. You've got the general gist of how to take a photo at this point. How do we use a flash with this camera? It doesn't have a flash socket, but you can use a flash with this camera with some limitations. So the way to do that is we're going to take a photo with it, but we're going to put it into bulb mode. So we're going to pull this lever out, and now when we push this lever down, the shutter is going to stay open until we let go. Okay? So that's how long the exposure is. In bulb mode, what you do is you could be in, say, a very dark room where the film's not going to record enough light to create an image. Open up the shutter, manually trigger a flash that's in your hand over here. Even a brand new flash would work. Click, manually trigger it, shut the shutter, and that's how you take a flash photo with the Box Tengor. Next thing we'll talk about is how to use the rangefinder. We kind of went over this, but or viewfinder technically, because it's not telling you how far anything is. Just all you have to do is make sure both of these are popped up, and then when you go to take a picture, look through here, and you'll sight up your image and be able to take the photo. To take an actual picture with the camera, you need to have this lever, or this frame, this wire frame popped up, because inside here, this wire frame gets, when it nests, when it's all the way down, at least except for the very first batch of these cameras, the wire frame gets into the shutter mechanism, and that works as a lock to prevent you from triggering the shutter. That's intentional. So you have to have this pulled up to take your photo. Then you'll look through the viewfinder in the back to get your image sighted as you want, and then you'll take a picture either in instant, which is where when this is pushed in, all you have to do is push this lever down, and the shutter will fire at approximately a 45th of a second. Or if you want to use bulb, as we saw, open the shutter, close the shutter, just like that. And then when you're done with your photo, all you have to do is advance the film, and well, that'll be that. You'll have taken your photo and moved on to the next one. Okay, what about a double exposure? Good news for you double exposure fans. This is a double exposure machine because the shutter is not linked to the film advance. So you can just sit and put exposure after exposure onto your film all day long and never advance it, and have all kinds of crazy exposure numbers on a single frame. Since there's no control really over aperture, shutter timing, things like that, if you're going to do this, you want to have a very forgiving film, such as a black and white film, a slower black and white film like 100 ISO or slower, or a forgiving C41 film, so that you can throw too much light at it and still get suitable results, because that's exactly what's going to happen when you do a double exposure with this camera. And so, this being a very simple camera, we have covered everything there is to know about how to use it. So I'm going to give you some tips on how to make the most out of your Box Tengor 5418. The first tip I have is that in full sun, you want to use a 50-ish ISO film, and that's due to the slow shutter speed being around 1/45th of a second and the aperture being f11. With the focusing Novar, I think there's also aperture control in that, so you've got a little bit more variability on that lens because it goes up to f6.3. If you want to use this indoors, you can. You'll just want to make sure to use an 800 ISO film or faster. If you're using black and white, definitely push it to 1600 or 3200. Modern C41 films can withstand a lot of abuse, and they will tend to work well in this camera because you can overexpose them and still get good results. Modern slide films, as I found out when I put some slide film through this camera, do get a bit of overexposure. Modern black and white films are also a very good option for this camera because they can withstand a lot of abuse as well. And one other thing, if you are really into 127 film, cutting your own from 120 stock is a good idea. Or you can buy HP5 Plus at Ilford's annual ultra-large format event in 44mm rolls, which is the perfect width for 127 film. Cut it to length and re-spool it onto backing paper. If you cut 120 film down to 127 width, you're going to have to re-spool that onto your own backing paper as well. So if you are really into 127 film, you will want to develop some good techniques for re-spooling your film by hand. Some things not to do with your camera: don't leave it in your car because it could get damaged by the heat and the cold. It's not going to be susceptible to lubricating oils getting places they shouldn't be, but extreme heat and extreme cold are not easy on old pieces of camera equipment. Plus, you might not necessarily want this stolen. Also, don't let it get wet because the metal in here is prone to rusting if it gets wet, and definitely don't want that because that could ruin an otherwise good camera. The lens on this is old optical glass. It's going to be softer than modern lenses, so be very careful when you clean it. And what I mean by that is if you have your lens cleaning tissue and you're going to grab your lens cleaning fluid, what you want to do is just spritz a little bit on the tissue, just like that. You're going to hold the camera here, and you're going to very gently touch at and dab at this. You do not want to put pressure. This is a very gentle action. And then dab it with a little bit of the dry tissue. You don't want to wipe dry tissue on this lens because you will scratch it. So everything you do here really should be dabbing. You can get away with a very gentle motion like this with the wet tissue. So just be cautious that you don't ruin the optical glass. And the last thing to remember is that your Box Tengor 5418 is a precision tool that should be handled with care and respect. And as long as you take care of your camera will take care of you. Thank you everybody very much for watching, and I will see you in the next camera manual video.